The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Mel's diner like desperate fingers seeking shelter, each drop a tiny percussion in the symphony of another dreary Tuesday morning. Sarah Chen wiped down the same vinyl booth for the third time, her calloused hands moving in practiced circles, while her mind wandered to the pile of unpaid bills tucked beneath her mattress at home. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had seen better decades. At 28, Sarah had the kind of face that revealed every sleepless night. Dark circles beneath her almond-shaped eyes, worry lines etched prematurely around her mouth, and a weariness that seemed to settle in her bones like winter cold. Her uniform, a faded pink dress with Mel's Diner embroidered in cursive across the pocket, hung loose on her diminishing frame. She'd been working double shifts for 3 months now, ever since her mother's medical bills had multiplied like hungry weeds. The bell above the entrance chimed weakly as Detective Marcus Rodriguez pushed through the door, his shoulders heavy with rain and something heavier still. Sarah's face brightened with genuine warmth, one of the few authentic smiles she managed each day. Marcus had been coming here for 2 years, ever since his divorce, ordering the same black coffee and wheat toast, leaving the same generous tip despite Sarah's protests. "Morning, detective," she called, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Rough night?" Marcus settled into his usual corner booth, the one with a clear view of both entrances and the kitchen. Old cop habits died hard. His weathered hands wrapped around the steaming mug she placed before him, and for a moment the simple warmth seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders. "Found another one last night," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 18 years on the force. "Homeless guy, maybe 60. Froze to death behind the grocery store. Had a photograph in his pocket. Little girl, probably his granddaughter. Smiling face, missing teeth." Sarah's heart clenched. She'd seen too many faces like that. People who'd slipped through society's cracks until they became invisible. The city had a way of consuming people, grinding them down until they were nothing more than statistics and police reports and social worker files. "What was his name?" she asked, refilling Marcus's cup without being asked. "That's just it. We don't know. No ID, no one to claim him. He'll be buried in Pottersfield with a number instead of a name." Marcus stared into his coffee as if searching for answers in its dark depths. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a war we can't win." Before Sarah could respond, the bell chimed again, and both their heads turned toward the sound. Through the rain-streaked glass, a figure moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured and careful. Sarah had seen him before, the man with the weathered crutches and the story written in scars across his face. Thomas Whitmore paused at the entrance, shaking rainwater from his worn jacket. At 52, he carried himself with a dignity that poverty couldn't quite erase, though it had certainly tried. His left leg, twisted from an accident that had stolen his previous life, dragged slightly as he maneuvered through the tables. The crutches, wooden and worn smooth by years of use, had become extensions of himself, tools that spoke of adaptation rather than defeat. Sarah had first noticed him 6 months ago, sitting on the bench across the street during her afternoon shifts. He never begged, never held a cardboard sign or rattled a cup of coins. He simply sat, watching the world pass by with eyes that seemed to hold both profound sadness and inexplicable hope. There was something about him that tugged at her heart. Maybe it was the way he always nodded respectfully to everyone who passed, or how he'd carefully fold and pocket any litter that blew near his bench.
"Table for one?" Sarah asked gently as Thomas approached the counter. She'd learned that treating him with the same courtesy she'd offer any customer seemed to matter to him. "Actually," Thomas said, his voice carrying traces of an education that hadn't been completely worn away by circumstance, "I was wondering if I might sit by the window. The rain makes beautiful patterns on the glass." There was poetry in the way he spoke, as if he understood that beauty could be found in the simplest observations. Sarah led him to a table near the front window, where the gray morning light filtered through the rain-streaked glass, creating an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of shadows and reflections. "Coffee to start?" she offered, though she knew he'd nurse one cup for hours, making it last like a small treasure. "That would be lovely, thank you." As Sarah poured the coffee, she noticed Thomas's hands, clean despite his circumstances, with neat fingernails and calluses that spoke of careful maintenance of his few possessions. His clothes were patched but clean, his hair combed with the kind of precision that suggested personal standards that poverty hadn't conquered. "Sarah," Marcus called from his booth, "you hear about the community meeting tonight? They're talking about the homeless situation again." She glanced back at the detective, then at Thomas, who had suddenly gone very still. The political discussions about homelessness always seemed to dance around the actual human beings living it, reducing complex stories to simple problems with simple solutions. "What kind of meeting?" Thomas asked quietly, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "City Council," Marcus replied, not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone who'd attended too many such meetings. "Business owners are complaining about the camp under the overpass. They want it cleared out before the holidays bring more tourists downtown." Thomas nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry years of understanding about how these discussions typically ended. Sarah found herself studying his profile as he gazed out the window, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the way he held himself despite his circumstances. There was a mystery there, layers of story that didn't quite fit the simple narrative of a man down on his luck. The morning rush began in earnest then, with office workers seeking caffeine and carbohydrates to fuel their daily battles. Sarah moved between tables like a dancer who'd memorized every step, refilling cups, taking orders, offering smiles that were part genuine warmth and part professional necessity. Through it all, she remained aware of Thomas at his window table, watching the rain and the passing people with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing stories in every face. During a brief lull, she approached his table with the coffee pot. "More coffee?" "Please." Thomas looked up at her with gratitude that seemed disproportionate to such a small kindness. "Sarah, isn't it? I've heard the other customers use your name." "That's right. And you're Thomas?" He seemed surprised that she knew, then pleased. "How did you—" "Detective Rodriguez ran your description through missing persons after you helped Mrs. Patterson find her wallet last week. Just checking to make sure you weren't, well, that someone wasn't looking for you." Thomas's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been relief mixed with another emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. "And was someone looking for me?" "No," she said softly. "No one was looking." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah had meant to be reassuring, but she realized how that might sound to someone who seemed to exist in the margins of society, unnoticed and unclaimed. "I have a daughter," Thomas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere. We lost touch after the accident." Sarah felt her heart twist. She wanted to ask more, to understand the story behind the sadness in his eyes, but the lunch rush was beginning and Mel's voice boomed from the kitchen, calling for orders. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself returning to Thomas's table whenever possible, refilling his coffee, bringing him a piece of pie she claimed was leftover but had actually paid for herself. There was something about him that reminded her of her father, who'd worked construction until a fall had changed everything. Maybe it was the dignity in the face of hardship, or the way he thanked her for every small kindness as if it were a gift. Near closing time, as Sarah was counting her tips, $14.37, barely enough for tomorrow's bus fare, Thomas approached the counter. He moved slowly, his crutches clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm she'd come to recognize. "Sarah," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want you to have this." He placed a small object on the counter, a compass, brass and beautiful, though tarnished with age. The face was cracked, and the needle quivered slightly, but it still pointed true north. "I can't take this," Sarah protested, but Thomas was already backing away. "It belonged to my grandfather. He always said it would help you find your way home when you were lost." Thomas's eyes held a weight of meaning that Sarah didn't fully understand. Maybe it will serve you better than it served me. Before she could respond, he was gone, moving out into the rain with careful, measured steps. Sarah held the compass in her palm, feeling its weight, wondering about the hands that had held it before hers and the journeys it had witnessed. Marcus approached the counter, leaving money for his coffee. "Interesting guy," he said, watching through the window as Thomas disappeared into the evening shadows. "There's more to his story than meets the eye." "What do you mean?" "Just a feeling. In my line of work, you learn to read people. He carries himself like someone who's used to being in charge, used to making decisions. The way he observes everything, takes mental notes." Marcus shrugged. "Could be military background, could be something else entirely." As Sarah locked up the diner that night, she found herself thinking about Thomas's words and the compass in her pocket. The city felt different somehow, charged with possibility and questions that didn't yet have answers. She didn't know that this was the beginning of something that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The rain had stopped, but the street still gleamed with reflected neon and streetlight. Somewhere in the city, Thomas was finding shelter for the night, carrying secrets that would soon reshape everything Sarah thought she knew about kindness, dignity, and the invisible threads that connect us all. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., the same relentless electronic shriek that had punctuated her mornings for the past 4 years. She rolled over in her narrow bed, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back from the cheap mattress and too many hours on her feet. The studio apartment she rented for $800 a month was barely larger than some people's closets, but it was hers, and in a city where homelessness sprawled across every underpass and park bench, having 4 walls and a door that locked felt like luxury. The morning ritual never varied. Instant coffee, the generic brand from the dollar store, and 2 pieces of wheat bread, toasted until they were just shy of burnt, because that's how long it took her to shower and dress in the shared bathroom down the hall. Mrs. Kowalski from 2B was usually finishing up her morning routine just as Sarah began hers, and they'd exchange tired smiles and comments about the weather or the landlord's latest excuse for not fixing the hot water heater. "You're too good to that place," Mrs. Kowalski said this particular Wednesday morning, her Polish accent still thick after 30 years in America. "Mel, he pays you nothing, works you like horse," Thomas said suddenly. Sarah knew she was right, but jobs weren't exactly abundant for someone without a college degree and with a gap in her resume from the 2 years she'd spent caring for her dying mother. Mel's diner wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and in her experience, steady was more valuable than prestigious. The bus ride to work took her through 3 distinct neighborhoods, each telling its own story of urban evolution. First, the gentrifying arts district, where young professionals jogged past murals that celebrated a grittier past they'd never experienced. Then through the industrial corridor, where warehouse workers gathered at bus stops with lunch boxes and thermos bottles, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of night shifts. Finally, downtown, where gleaming office buildings stood like monuments to ambition, their lobbies filled with people whose biggest daily worry was whether the coffee cart would have their preferred blend. Sarah pressed her face to the bus window each morning, watching these separate worlds blur together, wondering about the invisible boundaries that kept people in their assigned places. She'd once dreamed of working in one of those glass towers back when she'd been pre-med at the community college, before her father's accident, before her mother's diagnosis, before responsibility had narrowed her world to the space between survival and exhaustion. Mel's Diner occupied a corner that had somehow resisted the tide of urban renewal washing over downtown. Sandwiched between a boutique that sold $70 candles and a coffee shop that charged more for a single latte than Sarah made in tips some days. The diner existed in a temporal bubble where prices and expectations remained frozen in amber. Mel Kowalski, no relation to her neighbor, had owned the place for 22 years. A bear of a man with hands like baseball mitts and a vocabulary that would make longshoremen blush. He ran the kitchen with military precision, despite his gruff exterior. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods. The way he arranged his knives predicted whether it would be a day of gentle teasing or irritated silence. The way he hummed old country songs meant he was thinking about his late wife, Rosa, whose photograph still hung beside the register.
"Coffee's weak today," announced Betty Morrison, settling into her usual booth with the theatrical sigh of someone who'd perfected the art of complaint. At 73, Betty had been coming to Mel's longer than Sarah had been alive, treating the place like her personal dining room and Sarah like a granddaughter who never quite met expectations. "I'll make a fresh pot," though they both knew Betty would find something else to criticize within minutes. It was their morning dance, as predictable as sunrise. As Sarah went through the motions of her opening routine, checking the coffee levels, wiping down already clean tables, and adjusting the ancient radio until it found a station that came through clearly, her mind wandered to the compass Thomas had given her. She placed it on her nightstand, and this morning she'd found herself studying it while she drank her coffee, tracing the crack in its face with her fingertip. There had been something in his eyes when he had given it to her, a weight of significance that made her feel like she was holding more than just a broken navigation tool. She'd grown up in a family that believed objects could carry stories, that items passed between hands held the intentions and hopes of their previous owners. Her grandmother had called it memory made manifest, though she'd always assumed it was just another piece of folklore from the old country. The morning rush at Mel's had its own ecosystem. The construction workers who needed fuel before heading to job sites across the city. The office workers who'd calculated that Mel's coffee and Danish cost half what they'd pay at the trendy places. The retirees who came as much for human contact as for food, lingering over coffee and newspapers like it was their job to keep the world properly observed and commented upon. Detective Rodriguez arrived at his usual time, settling into his corner booth with the newspaper and the particular exhaustion of someone whose job involved cleaning up humanity's messes. Sarah poured his coffee without being asked, adding just enough cream to turn it the color of café au lait. "Any word on that homeless man from yesterday?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure why. She dealt with enough sadness without borrowing more from police reports. Marcus looked up from the paper, his expression grim. "Turns out he had a name after all. Walter Hendricks, 64, former military. His daughter came forward after seeing the story in the paper." He paused, stirring his coffee slowly. She'd been looking for him for 3 years. The weight of that information settled on Sarah like a blanket she didn't want. 3 years of searching, 3 years of wondering, ended by a newspaper story about a man who died alone behind a grocery store. She thought about Thomas, sitting at his table by the window, watching the world pass by. Did someone, somewhere, wonder what had happened to him?
The door chimed, and, as if summoned by her thoughts, Thomas entered. His morning routine had become as predictable as her own over the past months. The careful navigation between tables, the respectful nod to other customers, the selection of a seat that gave him the best view of both the street and the diner's interior. Sarah had noticed that he positioned himself where he could observe without being observed, a habit that suggested either caution born of vulnerability or the instincts of someone accustomed to responsibility. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, approaching his table with the coffee pot. She'd stopped asking if he wanted coffee, he always did, and the ritual of the question and answer seemed less important than the warmth in his smile when she remembered his name. "Good morning, Sarah. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She glanced out the window at the gray sky and the trash blowing down the sidewalk, but Thomas was looking at something else. A young mother pushing a stroller, stopping to let her toddler chase pigeons that scattered like leaves in the wind. The child's laughter was audible even through the window, pure joy that transformed the mundane street corner into something magical. "Yes," Sarah said, seeing it through his eyes. "It really is." As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly aware of the small dramas playing out around her. Betty Morrison, complaining about her coffee but leaving a $5 tip on a $3 bill because she knew Sarah was saving for her mother's headstone. Marcus Rodriguez, reading about crimes and tragedies but always asking about Sarah's health, her mother's memory, her plans for the future with the gentle concern of someone who'd learned that kindness was the only real weapon against despair. and Thomas, nursing his single cup of coffee, watching the street with the kind of attention that suggested he was cataloging stories in every passing face. When a homeless woman walked by, pushing a shopping cart filled with her possessions, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill, catching her eye through the window and pointing toward the diner's entrance. "Excuse me," he said to Sarah, "would it be possible to buy a meal for someone who might not be able to pay?" Sarah glanced toward the window, where the woman waited, uncertainty written across her weathered face. "Of course. Mel has a policy, no one goes hungry if we can help it." Thomas nodded toward the woman, who approached the door hesitantly. Sarah went to meet her, speaking in low, reassuring tones about hot coffee and fresh soup, treating her with the same courtesy she'd offer any paying customer. As the woman settled into a booth, Sarah noticed Thomas watching the interaction with an expression that seemed to hold both approval and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of shared experience. The lunch rush brought its usual chaos of orders and conversations, the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the grill, creating a symphony of organized disorder. Sarah moved through it like she was dancing to music only she could hear, reading the needs of each table, anticipating requests before they were made, maintaining the delicate balance between efficiency and care that kept people coming back. During a brief lull, she found herself at Thomas's table again, refilling his cup for the fourth time. "Sarah," he said quietly, "may I ask you something personal?" She nodded, settling into the chair across from him. The lunch crowd was winding down, and Mel was handling the remaining orders with his usual gruff competence. "Why do you do this?" Thomas gestured around the diner. "You're clearly intelligent, clearly capable of more than this." He seemed to catch himself, realizing how that might sound. "I don't mean to diminish what you do here. I just sense that this isn't where you plan to end up." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got when well-meaning customers asked about her real career or her high school classmates posted updates on their promotions and achievements on social media. But there was something in Thomas's question that was different, not judgment, but genuine curiosity about the path that had led her here. "I was pre-med once. Community college, then planning to transfer to the state university. I had it all mapped out, medical school, residency, maybe pediatrics or family practice." "What happened?"
Sarah thought about her small apartment, about the spare blanket in her closet, about the couch that folded out into a bed. The thought of inviting Thomas to stay with her crossed her mind, but she pushed it away. She barely knew him, and kindness had limits dictated by safety and social convention. "The weather's supposed to turn cold tonight," she said instead. "I'll be fine," Thomas replied, with the kind of certainty that came from experience. "I've weathered worse storms than this." As he prepared to leave, gathering his jacket and positioning his crutches, Sarah found herself wanting to say something more, to bridge the gap between concern and action, between sympathy and actual help. Instead, she pressed a container of leftover soup into his hands, ignoring his protests. "For later," she said, "when you get hungry." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes holding gratitude mixed with something that looked like sorrow. "Thank you, Sarah, for the soup, for the coffee, for treating me like a human being. You have no idea how rare that is." After he left, Sarah finished her closing routine with unusual thoughtfulness. She found herself thinking about invisible people, about the stories that walked past her window every day without being noticed or acknowledged. She thought about dreams deferred and paths not taken, about the difference between surviving and living. The compass Thomas had given her sat on the counter where she'd placed it while clearing tables. She picked it up, feeling its weight, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north with unwavering determination. Even cracked and tarnished, it still knew its purpose, still pointed the way home. As she locked the diner and headed for the bus stop, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow, she would start researching what it would take to go back to school. Not just thinking about it, but actually taking the first steps toward reclaiming the future she'd set aside. She didn't know that across town, Thomas was sitting on his narrow cot in St. Mary's Shelter, staring at his own hands and remembering what it felt like to sign checks that could change people's lives. She didn't know that he'd recognized one of the executives from lunch, or that their casual dismissal of her had stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. But she did know, with the certainty of that magnetic compass needle, that something was beginning to change. In her life, in her understanding of what was possible, in the very air around her that seemed charged with potential. The bus arrived, its doors opening with a pneumatic sigh, and Sarah stepped aboard carrying dreams she was finally ready to pursue. The next morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that turned breath into visible clouds and made every step on the pavement ring like struck metal. Sarah hurried toward Mel's diner, her thin jacket insufficient armor against the wind that seemed to slice through downtown's concrete canyons with surgical precision. She'd spent half the night researching community college programs and financial aid options, filling out preliminary applications by the light of her phone to save on electricity. The hope that had carried her to sleep felt more fragile in daylight, worn thin by the reality of minimum wage mathematics and the calculating voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her late mother. "Dreams don't pay bills, Sarah. Dreams don't put food on the table." Thomas was already at his usual spot when she arrived, but something was different. He sat straighter than usual, his weathered hands folded on the table with a precision that spoke of military training or boardroom discipline. His clothes were the same, worn but clean, but he wore them with an authority that hadn't been there before. "Morning, Thomas," Sarah said, approaching with the coffee pot. "You're early today." "Couldn't sleep. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about dreams and timing and second chances." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. She'd revealed more to this near stranger than she had to friends she'd known for years, and now she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to retreat into the safety of professional politeness. "I might have gotten a little carried away," she said, wiping down a table that was already clean. "It's easy to talk about big changes. Actually making them is different." "Is it?" Thomas's voice carried a challenge that made her look up. "Or do we just tell ourselves it is, to avoid the discomfort of growth?" Before Sarah could respond, the morning rush began with unusual intensity. The construction crews arrived earlier than normal, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands, ordering extra coffee and breakfast sandwiches to fuel them through the cold day ahead. The office workers followed, looking harried and checking their phones constantly, the kind of urban professionals who treated every minor inconvenience as a personal affront. Among them came a face Sarah didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s with the kind of expensive haircut and tailored coat that announced financial success from across the room. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having doors opened and tables made available. But her eyes held something harder than mere privilege. She surveyed the diner with the calculating gaze of a land developer eyeing prime real estate. "Table for one," the woman announced, not asked, settling into a booth near the window without waiting for Sarah's response. Her voice carried the crisp authority of boardrooms and conference calls, each word precisely enunciated and delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Of course," Sarah replied, grabbing a menu from the counter. "Coffee?" "I suppose, though I doubt it will meet my usual standards." She didn't look up from her phone, fingers flying over the screen with the focused intensity of someone conducting business at the speed of light. I'm Victoria Sterling, by the way. I'll be spending quite a bit of time in this neighborhood over the next few weeks." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she caught Thomas's reaction in her peripheral vision, a sudden stillness, like prey recognizing a predator's scent on the wind. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and his eyes fixed on Victoria Sterling with an intensity that transformed his entire demeanor. "Sterling Development," Thomas said quietly, though his voice carried clearly across the diner. "I should have expected you'd show up eventually." Victoria's head snapped up, her phone forgotten as she focused on the man with the crutches sitting by the opposite window. For a moment, her polished composure slipped, revealing something that might have been surprise or recognition. "Do we know each other?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was already calculating angles and advantages, treating even casual conversation as a negotiation. "We've never been formally introduced, but I'm familiar with your work. The Riverside apartment complex that displaced 300 families, the community center you demolished to build luxury condos, the homeless camp you had cleared with 24 hours' notice last winter." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Progress requires difficult decisions. I can't be responsible for every person who refuses to adapt to changing circumstances." The temperature in the diner dropped, though it had nothing to do with the weather outside. Other customers began to take notice, conversations quieting as they sensed conflict brewing between the well-dressed woman and the man with the crutches who suddenly seemed far more formidable than his circumstances suggested. Detective Rodriguez chose that moment to arrive, his cop instincts immediately registering the tension crackling between the two tables. He settled into his usual booth, but kept his attention focused on the developing situation, one hand casually resting near his radio. "And you are?" Victoria asked Thomas, her tone suggesting she was already bored with the conversation but curious enough to gather intelligence. "Someone who's seen the cost of your kind of progress. Someone who's learned that efficiency isn't the same thing as humanity." How philosophical. Victoria returned her attention to her phone with dismissive finality. "I'm sure your insights into business and development are fascinating, but I have actual work to do." Sarah found herself caught in the crossfire of an exchange she didn't fully understand, but whose implications felt enormous. She'd served both kindness and cruelty across these tables, but this felt different, larger, more consequential than personal dramas or individual struggles. "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Something in Thomas's reaction to Victoria Sterling had awakened a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. Victoria looked up again, this time focusing on Sarah with the kind of attention that felt like being examined under a microscope. "Urban renewal. This area has tremendous potential once we clear out the obstacles." "Obstacles?" Marcus Rodriguez's voice carried the flat authority of 18 years in law enforcement. "What kind of obstacles are we talking about, Miss Sterling?" "Obsolete businesses, substandard housing, populations that drain public resources without contributing to economic growth." Victoria's words were chosen with the precision of someone who'd given this speech many times before. "Places like this diner, for instance, prime real estate, wasted on establishments that barely generate enough revenue to justify their existence." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. She looked around the diner, at Betty Morrison reading her newspaper and making her morning coffee last an hour, at the construction workers planning their day over hearty breakfasts, at Thomas watching the exchange with growing intensity. These weren't obstacles, they were people living their lives, creating community in small but meaningful ways. "This diner has been here for 22 years, Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "People depend on it. Mel employs 8 people. Families eat here, friends meet here, deals get made, and stories get told. That has to count for something." Victoria's laugh was silk wrapped around steel. "Sentimentality doesn't pay property taxes, dear.
When the City Council votes to approve our development proposal next month, establishments like this will have 6 months to relocate or close. I'd suggest you start updating your resume." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. The security she'd built around this job, this routine, this small corner of stability dissolving like sugar in rain. 6 months. After 4 years of reliable work, dependable income, and carefully budgeted survival, she had 6 months to figure out what came next. "What kind of development?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made Sarah think of storm clouds gathering on distant horizons. "Luxury mixed use," Victoria replied, pulling out a tablet and swiping through architectural renderings with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to remaking landscapes according to her vision. 30-story residential tower, high-end retail on the ground floor, underground parking for 800 vehicles. Sterling Commons will be the crown jewel of downtown revitalization. She turned the tablet toward the room like a teacher presenting a lesson, displaying sleek, glass, and steel rising from perfectly manicured grounds. Where Mel's Diner currently stood, the rendering showed a boutique selling artisanal chocolates. Where the bus stop gathered working people each morning, elegant couples strolled past shops that sold nothing anyone in this room could afford. "Impressive," Thomas said, his tone suggesting anything but admiration. "And the current residents, the businesses that have invested decades in building this community?" "Market forces," Victoria replied with a shrug that dismissed thousands of lives with casual indifference. "Those who adapt will find opportunities in the new economy. Those who don't—" She let the sentence hang, its implications as clear as broken glass. Sarah felt rage building in her chest like pressure in a steam engine. This woman was discussing the destruction of her life, her livelihood, her carefully constructed stability, as if it were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. The diner around her suddenly felt precious and fragile. Every cracked vinyl booth and worn formica table transformed into irreplaceable artifacts of human connection. "How many people live in the buildings you're planning to demolish?" Marcus asked, his cop voice cutting through the rising tension.
Currently, about 400 units across 6 buildings, mostly low-income housing, some commercial space. Victoria scrolled through more documents on her tablet. "We're offering fair market value for the properties, of course. Current owners will have adequate time to relocate." Fair market value according to who? Thomas's question carried the precision of someone familiar with real estate negotiations. And adequate time for people who've lived in those apartments for decades to find new housing they can afford in a city where rents have tripled in 5 years? Victoria's smile tightened. "I'm not a social worker, Mr. Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore." For a split second, something flickered across Victoria's face. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. But it passed so quickly Sarah might have imagined it. "Mr. Whitmore, then. I understand that change can be uncomfortable, but cities are living organisms. They grow, they evolve, they improve. Sterling Commons represents progress, jobs, increased tax revenue, urban vitality. Sometimes progress requires difficult transitions." "And who benefits from this progress?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than her hands. "Because it doesn't sound like the people who actually live and work here." "Economic development benefits everyone," Victoria replied with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd given this answer countless times. "Construction jobs, service industry positions, increased property values for surrounding areas, improved infrastructure. Rising tides lift all boats." "Unless you don't have a boat? Unless you're drowning in the wake of someone else's yacht?" The morning rush was beginning to thin, but the remaining customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Betty Morrison had folded her newspaper and was watching the exchange with the sharp attention of someone who'd lived through enough neighborhood transformations to recognize the beginning of the end. "I've heard enough fairy tales for one morning," Victoria said, closing her tablet with decisive finality. "Ms." She looked at Sarah expectantly. "Sarah Chen. Ms. Chen, I'll have the coffee and whatever passes for a breakfast sandwich in this establishment. I have a conference call with the mayor's office in an hour, and I need to fuel up for more productive conversations than this one."
Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to tell this woman to take her development plans and our casual destruction of lives and find somewhere else to eat. But she needed this job for 6 more months, needed every tip and every hour of wages to build whatever came next. So she smiled the professional smile she'd perfected over 4 years of service, and she took the order. As she moved toward the kitchen, she caught Mel watching her with an expression that seemed to hold both sympathy and something else. Determination, perhaps, or the beginnings of a plan. The breakfast sandwich took longer than usual because Mel, who'd been listening from the kitchen pass-through, decided Victoria Sterling's order deserved special attention. Not the good kind. Sarah watched him prepare the sandwich with deliberate care, selecting the oldest bread, the most questionable cheese, the bacon that had been sitting under the heat lamp just a little too long. "Problem customer?" Mel asked, his gravelly voice carrying 30 years of dealing with difficult people. "She wants to tear down the diner," Sarah said, realizing as she said it how final it sounded, turn it into luxury retail space. Mel's hands stilled for a moment. He'd bought this place with money saved from 20 years of construction work, had built it into a neighborhood institution through early mornings and late nights, through holiday shifts and snow days, and the kind of stubborn persistence that defined his generation. "Over my dead body," he said finally, placing the sandwich on a plate with more force than necessary. When Sarah returned to Victoria's table, she found the woman deep in a phone conversation that seemed to involve charts and profit margins and quarterly projections. She slid the plate across the table without comment, but Victoria held up one manicured finger, demanding silence while she finished her call. "Yes, the environmental impact study is complete. No significant obstacles there. The community input session is scheduled for next Thursday evening at City Hall, but we don't expect any organized opposition. These kinds of neighborhoods don't tend to mobilize effectively." Victoria's eyes swept the diner dismissively. "Exactly. By spring, we'll be breaking ground." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Next Thursday? 1 week to prepare for a fight she didn't know how to fight, against opponents who had resources and influence she couldn't imagine? She glanced toward Thomas, who was listening intently while pretending to read a newspaper someone had left behind. After Victoria finished her call and took a few perfunctory bites of her sandwich, making a face that suggested Mel's special preparation had achieved its intended effect, she prepared to leave, gathering her coat and tablet with brisk efficiency. "Miss Chen," she said, pausing at Sarah's table, "I hope you'll consider what I said about updating your resume. Sterling Development has partnerships with several service industry companies. I might be able to arrange interviews for qualified candidates who approach the transition positively." The offer was clearly meant to be generous, a bone thrown over to smooth over the inconvenience of unemployment. But something in Victoria's tone suggested strings attached, loyalty purchased, voices silenced. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice neutral. "I'll keep that in mind." After Victoria left, the diner felt different, smaller somehow, more fragile like a house of cards in a rising wind. The remaining customers seemed subdued, as if they'd witnessed the reading of a death sentence and weren't sure how to respond. "She's lying about something," Marcus said, sliding into the booth Victoria had vacated. 20 years as a cop, you learned to spot deception. That whole conversation was performance art." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, refilling his coffee automatically. "The timeline, for one thing. Development projects like that take years of planning, environmental studies, zoning approvals, financing arrangements. She's talking like this just appeared on her desk last week, but I guarantee Sterling Development has been working on this for at least 2 years. Thomas approached their table, moving slowly but with purpose. "Detective Rodriguez is right, and there's something else. Victoria Sterling recognized my name. I saw it in her face for just a second before she covered it up." "So you two do know each other?" Sarah asked. "Not directly, but our paths have crossed in the business world before." Thomas's expression was grim. "Sterling Development has a reputation for getting what they want through whatever means necessary. Legal, barely legal, or technically legal after expensive lawyers find the loopholes." Marcus leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of means?" "Building code violations that mysteriously appear just before hostile takeovers.
sudden tax assessments that force small property owners to sell, anonymous complaints about health department violations, noise ordinances, fire safety issues, always just enough to create uncertainty and pressure, never quite enough to warrant serious investigation. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Can they do that? With enough money and the right connections, they can make life very difficult for people who stand in their way, Thomas replied. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We? Marcus raised an eyebrow. You're talking like this is personal for you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the street where Victoria Sterling's black sedan was pulling away from the curb. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm tired of watching people with power steamroll people without it. Maybe it's time someone stood up to Sterling Development.
And how exactly would we do that? Sarah asked, though even as she spoke, she felt something stirring in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something fiercer. Anger, perhaps, or determination, or the simple refusal to go quietly into whatever displacement Victoria Sterling had planned for them. First, we learn everything we can about their plans. Real timeline, actual financing, who's backing them, what approvals they still need. Thomas's voice carried the authority of someone who'd navigated corporate waters before. Then we organize. Every business owner, every tenant, every person who'll be affected by this development. We make ourselves visible, vocal, and impossible to ignore. And if that doesn't work? Marcus asked. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, she glimpsed something that looked like the executive he claimed to have been in another life. Then we get creative. The lunch rush that followed felt surreal, as if Sarah was serving food and pouring coffee in a dream where nothing was quite what it seemed. Every customer who walked through the door might be facing displacement. Every order might be one step closer to the last. Every conversation carried the undercurrent of uncertainty and change. But something else was happening too. Word was spreading about Victoria Sterling's visit, about her plans for the neighborhood, about the timeline that gave them so little time to respond. Betty Morrison made phone calls from the payphone outside, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been organizing community responses since before Sarah was born. The construction workers lingered over their coffee, talking in low voices about jobs and housing and the mathematics of survival in a city that seemed determined to price them out. Marcus spent his lunch break making calls of his own, using his police contacts to verify information about Sterling Development's permits and approvals. And Thomas sat at his table by the window, writing in a small notebook with the focused intensity of someone planning a campaign. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the compass Thomas had given her, about finding your way home when you were lost. She was beginning to understand that home wasn't just a place, it was a community, a network of relationships, an ecosystem of mutual support that took years to build and could be destroyed in a matter of months. When closing time approached, the diner felt different than it had that morning. Not just threatened, but galvanized. Not just vulnerable, but ready to fight. Sarah counted her tips, $22.16, and realized she wasn't just saving for her own future anymore. She was saving for a battle that would determine whether that future had a place for people like her. As she prepared to lock up, Thomas approached the counter one last time. "Sarah?" His voice carrying a weight of significance that made her look up from the register. "Tomorrow morning, would you be willing to take a walk with me? There are some things I need to show you, some people I think you should meet." "What kind of things?" "The kind that might help us save this place. The kind that might help you understand why Victoria Sterling was so interested in my name. I haven't been entirely honest about who I am, or who I used to be. Tomorrow, if you're willing, I'd like to change that." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something there she hadn't noticed before. Not just kindness or dignity, but power. Hidden, perhaps, or deliberately concealed, but unmistakably present. "Okay," she said.
surprised by her own certainty. "Yes, I'll take that walk with you." As Thomas made his way toward the door, pausing to exchange quiet words with Marcus Rodriguez, Sarah found herself thinking about turning points, about moments when ordinary people decided to become something more than ordinary. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The compass in her pocket seemed to pulse with possibility, its broken needle pointing not just toward magnetic north, but toward a future that was suddenly full of dangerous promise. Sarah arrived at Mel's diner 30 minutes early the next morning, her hands shaking slightly as she unlocked the door. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning through possibilities and questions that multiplied like cells dividing. Who was Thomas Whitmore, really? What connections did he have that could help them fight Sterling Development? And why did she feel like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into something vast and unknown? The pre-dawn quiet of the diner felt different now. Not peaceful, but expectant, like the held breath before a storm. Sarah went through her opening routine mechanically, her attention focused on the street outside, where early commuters were beginning their daily migrations. When Thomas appeared at exactly 7 o'clock, moving with his usual careful precision, but carrying himself with an authority that seemed more pronounced in the morning light, she felt her heart rate spike. "Ready for that walk?" he asked, settling at the counter instead of his usual table by the window. "Mal won't be in for another hour," Sarah replied, untying her apron. "I left a note explaining I'd be back before the breakfast rush." Thomas nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out what looked like a business card. He placed it face down on the counter, his weathered fingers holding it in place. "Before we go anywhere, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said months ago." He took a breath that seemed to carry years of weight. "My name is Thomas Whitmore, and that part is true. But the rest of my story, the accident, the homelessness, the disability, it's not entirely accurate." Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" Thomas flipped the business card over, and Sarah found herself staring at elegant black lettering on cream-colored paper. Thomas J. Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Industries. Below that, in smaller text, Sustainable Development, Community Investment, Social Innovation. The world went very quiet. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of morning traffic, but Thomas's words seemed to echo from somewhere far away. "You're a CEO." Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "You're actually a CEO?" "I was. I am. It's complicated." Thomas ran his hands through his gray hair, a gesture that seemed more vulnerable now than it had when she'd believed him to be homeless. "The disability is real. A car accident 3 years ago that shattered my left leg in 4 places. The crutches are real. But the homelessness, the poverty, that was a choice." Sarah stared at him, feeling betrayed and confused and angry all at once. "A choice? Why would anyone choose to live like that?" "Because I needed to understand. My company was involved in a development project in Philadelphia. Low-income housing, we said. Community revitalization, we called it. But what we actually did was displace 800 families to build luxury condos that none of them could afford." He paused, looking out at the street where morning was painting everything in shades of gold and gray. One of those families was a woman named Maria Santos, single mother, 2 kids, worked 3 jobs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment that was all she could manage. When we bought the building, we gave her 60 days of notice. 60 days to find new housing in a city where rents had doubled in 5 years.
She couldn't find anything she could afford. Ended up living in her car with her children, trying to keep them in the same school district, washing their clothes in gas station bathrooms, feeding them from food banks. Thomas's voice broke slightly. Her 8-year-old son wrote me a letter, drew a picture of their old apartment, asked if they could please have it back because his sister was scared sleeping in the car. The weight of those words settled between them like stones. Sarah thought about children sleeping in cars while luxury condos rose from the foundations of their former homes, and she began to understand the depth of guilt that would drive someone to abandon everything familiar. What happened to them? Maria had a breakdown. Anxiety, depression, panic attacks that landed her in the emergency room. Lost all 3 jobs. The kids ended up in foster care. Thomas closed his eyes. I tried to help then. Found them an apartment, paid the first year's rent, set up a trust fund for the children's education. But it was too late. The damage was done. The family was broken. Sarah felt tears she didn't expect pricking at her eyes. So, you decided to live on the streets. I decided I needed to understand what I'd done. What my decisions, made in boardrooms with profit projections and market analyses, actually meant in human terms. Thomas opened his eyes and Sarah saw determination there alongside the regret. I've spent the last 18 months learning how to be invisible, how to survive without resources, how it feels to be dismissed and ignored and treated like you don't matter. And Whitmore Industries still exists, still operates. I have a board of directors, a capable management team, enough momentum to keep running without me micromanaging every decision. Thomas smiled ruefully. I've been working remotely, you might say, making different kinds of choices, focusing on different kinds of projects. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to reconcile the man she had been serving coffee to for months with the CEO whose business card lay between them like evidence in a trial. The compass you gave me, was that real? My grandfather's, yes. He was a Navy man, served in World War II. He always said it would help you find your way home when you were lost. Thomas reached across the counter and gently touched her hand. I was lost, Sarah. Maybe I still am. But these months here, watching you work, seeing how you treat people with dignity and kindness, it's been like finding magnetic north again. Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Detective Rodriguez entered, stamping his feet against the morning cold. He took one look at the business card on the counter and smiled knowingly. So, you finally told her. I was wondering how long you were going to keep up the act. Sarah spun to face him. You knew? You knew who he was this whole time? Not the whole time, but I ran as prince after that conversation about Sterling Development yesterday. Thomas J. Whitmore, no criminal record, but plenty of newspaper articles about his business dealings, most of them pretty positive, actually. The question is, what are you planning to do about Victoria Sterling? Thomas stood slowly, reaching for his crutches with movements that Sarah now realized carried authority along with physical limitation. I'm planning to stop her. We're planning to stop her, if Sarah is willing to trust me despite my deception. Sarah looked between the two men, feeling like she had stumbled into someone else's story. 3 days ago, her biggest worry had been whether she could afford to go back to school. Now she was apparently part of a coalition against a development company led by a CEO who'd been pretending to be homeless while conducting some kind of social experiment or personal penance. This is insane, she said finally. You're talking about taking on Sterling Development, a major corporation with lawyers and lobbyists and connections to City Hall, with what? A diner waitress, a cop, and a CEO who's been living a lie for 18 months? No, Thomas replied, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what looked like a contacts list. I'm talking about taking them on with a network of community organizations, housing advocates, small business owners, and media contacts who've been waiting for the right case to challenge predatory development practices. Plus, a CEO who understands exactly how companies like Sterling operate because he used to be one of them. The phone in his hand buzzed with incoming messages, and Sarah realized that Thomas had been far from inactive during his months of careful observation.
Whatever plan he was executing had been in motion long before Victoria Sterling had walked into Mel's diner. "Who are you calling?" Sarah asked. "Friends, allies, people who believe that communities matter more than profit margins." Thomas looked up from his phone. The first one is Jennifer Walsh, investigative reporter for the Tribune. She's been tracking Sterling Development's practices across 3 states. Turns out they have a pattern of using shell companies and questionable financing to push through developments that benefit investors at the expense of existing communities. The bell chimed again, and Betty Morrison entered, followed by 3 other regulars Sarah recognized but didn't know well. Word was clearly spreading about something, though Sarah wasn't sure what. "Sarah, dear," Betty said, approaching the counter with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. "I've been making phone calls. Seems like half the neighborhood got notices yesterday about property assessments, building inspections, permit reviews, all very official, all very intimidating, all happening at once." "Sterling Development," Marcus said grimly. "They're applying pressure. Classic intimidation tactics. Make people think they're in legal trouble, that selling becomes the safer option than fighting." Thomas nodded. Jennifer Walsh predicted this. It's their standard playbook when they encounter potential resistance. They try to create chaos and uncertainty to discourage organized opposition. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were up against, but also strangely energized. For the first time in years, she was part of something larger than her own daily survival, connected to people who were willing to fight for principles that mattered. "What do we do?" she asked. "We document everything, every notice, every inspection, every interaction with city officials. Jennifer needs evidence of coordinated harassment." Thomas looked around the diner, which was filling with people who seemed to understand that something important was happening. "We organize. Tonight, emergency community meeting at St. Mary's Church, 7 o'clock. Spread the word to every business owner, every tenant, every person who will be affected by Sterling Commons." The next few hours passed in a blur of coffee service and whispered conversations, phone calls, and hastily scribbled notes. Sarah found herself at the center of a communication network she hadn't known existed, connecting neighbors who'd been strangers despite living blocks apart. Mrs. Patterson from the corner market, worried about her lease renewal. Carlos from the automotive shop, already facing pressure from building inspectors. Elena from the community center, trying to organize legal aid for tenants who'd received eviction notices. By noon, Thomas had made 12 phone calls and filled 3 pages of his notebook with names, numbers, and action items. Sarah watched him work, seeing glimpses of the executive he'd been, the authority and strategic thinking that had built a successful company. But she also saw something else, a humility and connection to human consequences that his months on the street had taught him. "Jennifer Walsh will be at the meeting tonight," Thomas announced during a brief lull in the lunch rush. "So will David Kim from the Housing Rights Coalition and Maria Santos."
Sarah's head snapped up. The woman from Philadelphia? The one with the children? She's become a housing advocate, speaks at community meetings, testifies at city council sessions, helps other families navigate displacement. Thomas's smile held both pride and sadness. She forgave me, eventually, said what mattered wasn't preventing the past, but changing the future. The afternoon brought more revelations. Jennifer Walsh arrived early, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with a recorder and a notebook filled with research on Sterling Development. She interviewed Sarah, Marcus, and several other community members, building a case that connected local harassment to a broader pattern of predatory practices. "They've done this in 7 cities over the past 5 years, Jennifer explained, showing Sarah articles from newspapers across the region. Same tactics, same timeline, same results. Displaced communities, broken promises about affordable housing, developments that price out the people who lived there first. But they haven't been stopped? Not yet. They're good at what they do, staying just within legal boundaries, using legitimate processes for illegitimate purposes. But this case might be different." Jennifer looked at Thomas with something that might have been respect. Having an insider who understands their methods could change everything. As the evening approached, Sarah found herself thinking about transformation, not just her own plans to return to school,
but the way ordinary people could become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. She was still angry about Thomas's deception, still confused about what it meant to fight alongside someone who'd lived a lie for months. But she was also beginning to understand that some truths were larger than individual honesty, that some battles required complex alliances between people who might not trust each other completely, but shared a common cause. The community meeting at St. Mary's Church drew nearly 200 people, more than Sarah had expected, more than anyone had expected. Families with children, elderly residents worried about losing their homes, business owners facing uncertain futures, young professionals who'd moved to the neighborhood because it still felt like a real community rather than a luxury development. "My name is Thomas Whitmore," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Some of you know me as the man who sits at Mel's Diner, who feeds pigeons in the park, who sleeps at St. Mary's Shelter. All of that is true, but there's more to the story." He told them about Whitmore Industries, about the Philadelphia Project, about the choice to understand displacement from the inside rather than observing it from boardroom windows. He told them about Maria Santos, about 8-year-old children asking to come home to apartments that no longer existed. "I can't undo the damage I've done, but I can use what I've learned to prevent it from happening again. To you, to your families, to your community."
Maria Santos spoke next, sharing her story and the stories of other families who'd been displaced by developments that promised community improvement but delivered community destruction. Her words carried the authority of lived experience, the credibility that came from surviving what Sterling Development had planned for all of them. Jennifer Walsh presented her research, connecting Sterling's local activities to their national pattern of predatory development. David Kim from the Housing Rights Coalition explained their legal options, the timeline for mounting effective opposition, the resources available to support their fight. By the end of the evening, they had a plan. Legal challenges to Sterling's permits and environmental assessments, media campaigns to expose their practices, community organizing to ensure maximum turnout at the city council meeting where Sterling's proposal would be voted on, and Thomas Whitmore's commitment to use Whitmore Industries' resources to support affordable housing development that actually served the existing community. As people filed out of the church, Sarah found herself walking beside Thomas, their conversation taking place in the quiet that followed intense community action. "Are you still angry with me?" he asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "But I understand why you did it, and I'm more angry at Sterling Development than I am at you. That's probably appropriate." They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, the city around them feeling different now that Sarah understood how many people were willing to fight for it. "Thomas," she said as they approached Mel's Diner, "what happens after we stop Sterling Development? What happens to you, to your experiment in invisible living?" Thomas paused at the diner's door, looking through the window at the empty tables and chairs that had been the center of so many conversations, so many small moments of human connection. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not the same person who decided to live on the streets 18 months ago, but I'm not sure I can go back to being a CEO who makes decisions about people's lives from conference rooms either." Sarah pulled out the compass he'd given her, its brass surface warm from her pocket. The needle still pointed north, unwavering despite the crack across its face. Maybe the answer isn't going back. Maybe it's finding a different direction entirely. Thomas smiled, and Sarah saw hope there alongside the uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new possibilities. But tonight, they had taken the first steps towards something unprecedented. A community that refused to be disappeared, led by people who'd learned that transformation was possible at any age, under any circumstances. The compass needle trembled slightly in the streetlight, then settled, pointing toward whatever came next. 6 months later, Sarah walked across the community college stage in her cap and gown, her acceptance letter to the State University's pre-med program tucked safely in her purse. The crowd erupted as she received her diploma,
Thomas cheering from the front row, Detective Rodriguez whistling through his fingers, and half of Mel's Diner's regular customers on their feet applauding. Sterling Commons had been defeated by a coalition that grew beyond anyone's imagination. But more importantly, it had been replaced by something better. Whitmore Community Development, Thomas's new venture, was breaking ground on affordable housing that would keep families in their neighborhood while creating opportunities for growth. Mel's Diner still stood on its corner, busier than ever, with Sarah working weekend shifts between her advanced science courses. The compass Thomas had given her sat on her bookshelf now, its cracked face reflecting light from the window, still pointing toward true north, still guiding people home. The invisible had become visible. The lost had found their way. And sometimes, that's how the world changes. One cup of coffee, one act of kindness, one person seeing another's humanity at a time. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next story.
Life happened. My father fell from a construction scaffold when I was 20. Spinal injury, disability, depression. Then my mother got sick, cancer. The slow kind that takes years to kill you and costs everything you have trying to fight it. Sarah traced patterns on the table with her finger, not meeting Thomas's eyes. By the time she died, I'd used up my savings, maxed out my credit cards, and hadn't been in school for 2 years. Starting over felt impossible. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Do you ever think about going back?" "Every day," Sarah admitted, "but thinking and doing are different things. I'm 28. I'd be starting medical school at 32 if I could even get in. Residency at 36. I'd be older than most attendings when I finally finish training." "And that matters?" The question caught her off guard. "Doesn't it?" "I once knew a woman who went to law school at 45. She'd been a secretary for 20 years, raised 3 children, buried a husband. Everyone told her she was too old to start over. She became a federal judge at 62. He smiled, and Sarah saw something in his expression that suggested this wasn't just a story he'd heard, but a memory he'd lived. "Age is just time, Sarah. Time you have to fill with something. The question is whether you fill it with regret or with purpose." Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and a group of business executives entered, their expensive suits and confident voices filling the space like an occupying force. Sarah rose automatically, reaching for menus, but not before she caught the look that passed across Thomas's face, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or perhaps distaste. As she served the new customers, fielding their complaints about the limited wine list and requests for modifications to menu items, Sarah found herself thinking about Thomas's words. The executives treated her with the casual dismissiveness reserved for service workers, speaking around her rather than to her, discussing deals and strategies as if she were furniture with the ability to bring food. When she returned to Thomas's cable, he was watching the business lunch with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Friends of yours?" she asked lightly. Thomas's laugh was dry, without humor. "Not exactly, though I recognize the type." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I used to be them in another life." "What kind of work did you do?" For a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. His eyes grew distant, focused on something beyond the rain-streaked window, beyond the present moment. "I built things. Mostly companies. I was good at seeing what people needed and finding ways to give it to them. I thought I was making the world better, more efficient, more connected. It turns out efficiency and connection aren't the same thing as kindness or compassion." Sarah wanted to ask more, to understand the journey that had brought him from corporate success to his current circumstances. But the afternoon was slipping away, and there were tables to clear, dishes to wash, preparations for the dinner shift that would begin in a few hours. As closing time approached, Sarah tallied her tips, $18.43, enough for groceries and bus fare with a little left over. Thomas had long since finished his coffee, but he remained at his table, watching the street grow quiet as the business day ended. "Thomas,
Sarah said, approaching with the coffee pot one last time. "Where do you go at night?" The question surprised them both. Sarah hadn't meant to ask it so directly, but something about the approaching evening made her think about warmth and safety, about the luxury of having a place to return to. "There's a shelter downtown, St. Mary's. They have beds for 30 people, and I'm usually lucky enough to get one."